sexual selection. In this set of slides, what we're going to do is talk about and try to understand why Darwin decided that in addition to natural selection, which would produce adaptive evolution, he needed to have another kind of selection, which he referred to as sexual selection. Now, one of the reasons, the main reasons, that he decided that there needed to be another kind of selection besides natural selection was that in many species of organisms, not all, but in many species of organisms, there are substantial differences between the sexes. And we can see that here with the male peacock and the peahen, how different they are visually from one another. And it's true in other species you might not think of. So here's a species of ant, or actually they're flies, I'm sorry, stalk-eyed flies. And you'll note that the males have their eyes on stalks that are much more broadly placed than on the females. And here is an example you're probably familiar with. This is a species of antelope, and the male has a set of horns, but the female lacks them. And so Darwin looked at this and said, you know, I can't really explain this by natural selection. Why should selection be different on males and females? It seems like if something was good for one of them, it would be likely to be good for the other one. So he decided he needed to come up with another type of selection called sexual selection to explain these types of differences. One of the reasons that we think that sexual selection takes place, and there's actually good experimental evidence for this, is that there is competition for mates between individuals of a particular sex. Now, more often this is for the males than it is for the females, and I'm not going to discuss why that would be. But more often, there's more competition between males for a mate than there is between females for the mates. And this can drive the evolution of certain types of sexually dimorphic or secondary sexual traits. So, for example, when we were looking at the horns or the antlers on the antelope, the males have evolved those because they are involved in fights that take place for access to females. And the males have contests between one another to determine which one is going to actually be able to mate and reproduce. And the females don't have these contests because basically there are enough males so that all the females can become pregnant, but there's a limited set of females out there for the males, and the males there's been selection on the males to be able to determine who is going to have access for mating. Another way that sexually selected traits could come about is by what's called mate choice. This is where one sex actually selects those secondary sexual characteristics. And again, here things are going to be, well, not again, but things are going to be reversed. Here the females are the ones that are causing the sexual selection to take place in most cases. So for example, the peacock's tail, peacocks don't fight with each other, but they do display to the females, and then the females choose the male they want to mate with based on what they determine is the quality of that display of the tail. And so this is mate choice, where the choices made by the females ends up selecting for particular traits in the males, in the case of the peacocks, particular types of tails, the size of the tails, the colors, the way things are spread out, etc. Now, why is this different from natural selection? Well, as I mentioned before, it ends up affecting one sex differently than it does the other sex. And so sexual selection is going to be a special kind of selection because of this differential selection on the sexes. One of the other ways that you can know, at least in some cases, that sexual selection is different from natural selection is that they can actually act in opposite directions to one another. Natural selection may act in one way, and then sexual selection may act in exactly the opposite way. And there's an example that I want to show you of this. It's in this type of bird here called widow birds. Widow birds, as you can see from this slide, male widow birds, have very long tail feathers. And in fact, we know, and I'll show you the evidence for this, that the longer the tail feathers, the more attractive they are to females for mating. So this is a case of mate choice where females have selected for very, very long tail feathers in the males. However, we also know, and I'll show you the data for this as well, that males with longer tails also don't fare as well. They're more likely to die, and their bodies tend to be in poorer condition than males that have shorter tails. And part of the reason for this is simply that the long tail demands a greater energetic expense in flying. These long tails actually do not help the birds to fly. It makes it harder for them to fly. And so the birds with the longer tails do better in terms of getting mating opportunities, but they also have a harder time just living. So natural selection does not favor longer tails. It favors shorter ones. So let's look at the evidence for this. This is taken from a paper where an experimenter did two manipulations. The tails that are about 8 centimeters in length, so that would be, if you're looking from the left, the third black bar. The tails that are 8 centimeters in length are approximately the longest tail size that you would normally see in nature for the widow birds. And you can see that by looking above them at the bars that are in white. That's the natural tail frequency that was found in this population. And then if you look at the ones with shorter tails, you can see that their bars are lower. Now those lower bars are there because the males with the shorter tails are actually actively guarding and females at fewer nest sites. So note that the shorter tailed ones, the ones that have 6 and 7 centimeter tails, on average only have about one active nest that they're involved with, whereas the ones with 8 centimeter tails have twice as many nests that they're active in. So they're leaving more offspring if they have a longer tail. And we know that the longer tail is attracted to females because one of the other things that the researchers did was they created artificially super long tails. That's that last bar on the right. They created some males that had 22 centimeter long tails. Now these don't occur in nature, but what they did was they snipped off the tail feathers from other males and then glued them on to these males to create super long tail feathers. And what you can see is that these males with super long tail feathers were very strongly preferred by the females. In fact, on average, they were guarding 5 nest sites. So if nature, or if there's variation in the males for longer tail feathers, the females would in fact select for super long tails. Now why don't we see super long tails in nature? One reason could simply be that there's not enough genetic variation to produce those long tails. But another reason could be that natural selection is actually acting so strongly against males with those super long tails that they can't survive on their own. And we have some evidence to show that that is likely to be true. And let's see the next slide. Okay. Now, give me a second to explain what this slide looks like before you try to interpret it. On the x-axis, we have the number of days since the male established its territory. Okay? So we're looking over time at what happens to males after they establish their territories. And then we also have a measure of what their body condition is. And we won't worry exactly how they measured body condition, but lower numbers mean poor body condition. Now we also have two different groups of males. We have control males that just have their normal tail length. And then we have some tails on males that were artificially given shorter tails. In other words, these males were caught by the researchers and their tails were snipped off to be shorter than they would actually be. And what we can see from these two regression lines that were fitted to the two different sets of data is that the males that had shorter tails maintained better body condition throughout the mating season than the males that had the longer control length tails. And so what this is showing is that males that have longer tails end up having poorer body condition throughout the mating period. There's a cost, in other words, to having this long tail. And so, unfortunately, in this experiment, they also didn't try and see what would happen to males that had the super long tails, but presumably they had also made males with artificially long tails. We would have seen even poorer body condition. And if the body condition were sufficiently poor, that would explain why, even though the females would love it if there were some males out there with 22 centimeter long tails, we don't actually end up finding that in nature. Okay, so if you've understood what we've just talked about, you understand what natural selection is and you have seen a case where natural selection and sexual selection are opposing one another in terms of what they are selecting for.